Folks, BlackRock is making incredibly aggressive moves right now in Ukraine, and very soon they might end up owning all of it. And as you likely know, BlackRock has gotten a lot of attention here in the US the last couple of years because of their hostile activity within American suburbs. For their practice of buying single-family homes in suburbs, jacking up the rent prices massively, and then, of course, renting them back to working families. They then go and try to buy up the rest of the neighborhood and jack up the prices on those even more, causing their previous single-family home purchases to appreciate even faster, and of course at the same time eliminating all of their competition and making it so that people that are trying to buy a home in that area have no other choice but to rent. And quite frankly, the truth is that BlackRock has a long history of using every crisis to make a profit. Well, this time around, BlackRock is taking very, very aggressive action in Ukraine, and the actions that it is taking right now will essentially allow them to control most of the private investment in the country and make out like bandits during reconstruction. And the kicker is that this is going to be a win-win for BlackRock, because even in a situation where Ukraine ends up losing a lot of its land, if Ukraine loses its territory, well, they may still have a pretty big negotiating tip, considering they have substantial investment still in Russia and substantial connections still in Russia, and they have a history of working with Russia pretty closely. There is a reason why there's so much controversy around BlackRock. They have trillions and trillions of dollars, $8 trillion in total in client-managed assets, and they deploy that around the world in very, very unique ways that tend to bring in a lot of money, a lot of profito. There is a clear reason that you see viral video after viral video saying BlackRock is the company that owns the world, the most powerful company that you have never heard of. BlackRock, the company that controls the world's governments. And they own you, but you'll never know. BlackRock. There is a clear reason they have this reputation, because they're very, very smart at going into certain locations and seizing a lot of influence, property, assets at dirt cheap prices, and then turning them around. Somebody once said that you should never let a crisis go to waste, and I would argue BlackRock never does. And so in today's video, I want to break down what BlackRock is doing in Ukraine right now, because they are again making some really, really strategic and aggressive moves that is going to greatly expand the company's reach and profitability and influence in the coming years to a level that likely no one has ever seen before. And if you appreciate our research and content like this, make sure to hit that ravishing like button and subscribe. In return, it helps tell YouTube to push this video out to more and more people. Okay, so BlackRock is preparing for a massive, massive financial win in Ukraine. Whether this war ends tomorrow or in another 10 years, BlackRock is setting themselves up to benefit massively from it. Jacobin reports Ukraine is being sized up by neo-colonial vultures from BlackRock to the EU for a carve-up after the war is over. On the menu is deregulation, privatization, and tax efficiency, measures that have already begun. Now, a lot of these things are good for the economy, getting the government out of the way, but the way that this is going to be enacted is likely going to be primarily for the benefit of BlackRock. And they're the ones that are going to be overseeing this and pushing through a lot of these new policies. Now, here's the context of how this is happening. So if you remember back on February 24th, 2022, Russia launched the invasion of Ukraine. This set off a long string of events, which include big Western sanctions against Russia and investors running away from Ukraine to avoid the fallout from the war. However, it created a big, big stinking opportunity for organizations that have a lot of money, influence, and connections like BlackRock to go in and start buying a lot of these assets and influencing the government when there's a massive war over both of their heads. Since last year, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink and other execs have had innumerable conferences with Ukrainian President Zelensky, and they have been discussing what the president calls coordination of efforts to rebuild Ukraine. They call this reconstruction. Now, why would BlackRock, one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent, asset manager in the world, investment manager, pension fund manager, retirement account manager in the world, want to rebuild Ukraine? Is it because of philanthropy? Is it because they want to stick it to Russia? Well, no, BlackRock is not a charity. And no, BlackRock has investments in Russia. So again, not exactly sticking it to Russia. They have put out some press releases since the invasion saying they're divesting from Russia, but it's been pretty damn slow. Let me just tell you that. And there's still substantial assets there. Pretty clear that they're trying to wait until the whole thing blows over and then just keep all of their holdings. A lot of their investments are actually alongside the Russian government, like specifically in the oil sector. So again, hard to argue that these people are trying to stick it to Russia. So BlackRock, in my view, is doing this because they know they can wield their influence and get tons of extra money if they seize the opportunity of this sensitive situation. And in fact, the latest public meetings happened just about 2 weeks ago as Zelensky met with the latest round of BlackRock execs. And backing up a second, if you are the president of a country in the middle of a big invasion, a very, very bloody and disastrous invasion, well, why would you be spending your time meeting with American private equity funds. Why would you be doing that so frequently on top of that? Well, of course, because you know they can bring in tons of money and help you rebuild your economy. That makes total sense. But you also have to know that these private equity funds, they're not going over there because they want to be a charity. They don't go over there for philanthropy. Private equity funds, especially the type on Wall Street, aren't going into these areas to invest in war-torn countries unless they can get something huge in return. Like they can get the government to do whatever they want type of return. And this is a situation where Ukraine has been invaded by this other country and they need the West more than ever. And they're like, okay, well, we can bend to literally any demand that you have as long as you invest in our country, or at least promise that when reconstruction happens after the war ends, whenever that may be, well, you're going to invest heavily in us. And it's pretty obvious that Blackrock is playing that game here. They know they can get tons and tons of land, other types of financial assets, other types of property within this country for war-torn prices. And when reconstruction happens, well, they can pre-negotiate a deal to make sure that the government continues to back them. Agreements could potentially set Blackrock up to have a complete monopoly over this country, this massive, massive country, once the war ends. Jacobin reports, quote, in November last year, Ukrainian President Zelensky signed a memorandum of understanding with Blackrock that will see the firm's Financial Markets Advisory, the FMA, a special consulting unit set up after the 2008 crash to work with crisis-stricken governments, advise Ukraine's economic ministry on designing a roadmap for rebuilding the war-torn country. So Blackrock here is saying, hey, you let us oversee your reconstruction and we'll give you the investments. But likewise, the Ukrainian government and Blackrock launched the Ukraine Development Fund just a couple weeks ago on May 8th. Quote, the fund will also help Ukraine to rebuild critical infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and power stations that were damaged during the conflict. The launch of the UDF is seen as a positive development for Ukraine's economy, and it is hoped that it will attract significant investment from domestic and international investors. And you look at pictures of different Ukrainian cities, they are going to need a lot of investment to fix all of this stuff, and quite frankly, who is going to want to invest when the war is still active, right? What if you're a business, you invest a ton of money, and then Russia just goes and missiles it? Well, that would suck. But you see, a firm like Blackrock, they can afford to risk billions and billions of dollars as long as the Ukrainian government gives them a juicy enough deal. And as long as they do this before the rest of the investors feel confident to invest in Ukraine again. The more they can get Ukraine to agree to before the conflict ends, the better deal they're going to have for once reconstruction actually starts. So it looks like Blackrock's game plan is to, number one, swoop in, which they've done. Number two, rewrite the rules, which they're already doing. Number three, oversee and facilitate the entire reconstruction. And then number four, massive profito. Barron's reports the head of U.S. asset management firm Blackrock said Thursday that Western investors will be flooding Ukraine post-war, and the country could become a beacon to the rest of the world of the power of capitalism. Larry Fink, one of the world's most influential investors, told a Ukraine-themed event in Davos that he estimated the country would need $750 billion in reconstruction funds and aid if the war stopped relatively soon. I do believe, emotionally, those who truly believe in a capitalist system will be flooding Ukraine with capital, Fink added. And I'm not talking about philanthropy. There's going to be a lot of philanthropy. I'm truly talking about if we can rebuild Ukraine, it can be a beacon to the rest of the world of the power of capitalism, he said. So obviously, this is a very, very smart way to brand this. You see, Blackrock can help them rebuild and brand it as a capitalist story, which allows them to have a good story and make a ton of money, and also hides the elephant in the room. The elephant being that Blackrock is likely going to control not just the Ukrainian government, but large percentages of the Ukrainian economy. And if they do this correctly, the government can make sure that other competing interests have to go through Blackrock or not at all. If somebody wants to invest in Ukraine in 10, 20 years, what's going to happen? They're going to have to say, okay, we'll go ahead and call Blackrock, and they'll facilitate it for you, which is a great strategy for Blackrock, but it's also very, very ironic because they're trying to say this is a capitalism story. But that isn't capitalism, that is crony capitalism, where you use the government to pick and choose the winners, right? But you have to understand history as well, because Blackrock is an absolute genius at using a crisis to expand its power and use a centralized authority, whether that's a Federal Reserve or a government, to put its thumb on the scale and make them tons and tons of money. For example, they made out like bandits during COVID. Quote, in the United States, it, referring to Blackrock, has been particularly controversial for running the Federal Reserve's pandemic-era bond buying program, nearly half of which ended up making purchases in Blackrock's own funds. So a bad private equity fund does things that make them profits while pissing off the public. But a good and strategic private equity fund figures out how to position itself as the solution to a real crisis and then profits off that. That way they make a ton of money. They provide what seems to be a good value. It's the same thing with reconstruction. They can position themselves as the savior of Ukraine and somebody that's willing to invest while at the same time positioning themselves to dominate. And it looks like the strategy is already paying off pretty well. Ukraine is already opening up for investment in December last year as Kyiv and Blackrock were months into their discussions. The Ukrainian parliament rammed through property developer-backed legislation that had stalled prior to the war, deregulating urban planning laws to the benefit of a private sector that has been hungrily eyeing the demolition of historic sites. So as time goes on, you're likely going to see more and more legislation come out that favors a rewriting of the rules to benefit BlackRock and to benefit investment that they can bring into that region. And remember, not only will BlackRock have huge dominion over the reconstruction of Ukraine and their cities, but there's also a lot to be gained here from a real estate perspective. Ukraine was once called the breadbasket of Europe because it has over 74 million acres of uncharacteristically fertile earth known as black soil. It was among the top 3 exporters of grain in the world. It has a ton of other natural resources like iron ore, coal, natural gas, and oil. It had a big manufacturing industry prior to the war. It has a geographically strategic location. So in other words, there's a lot of money for BlackRock in this region. So presumably they want to make sure that's all theirs and they want to write the rules so they can have as much of it as possible with as little competition as possible. Not to mention they have a ton of connections all over the West and in the highest seats in the West, such as in the Biden administration. The Biden administration, for example, has substantial ties to BlackRock, and several of them have worked for BlackRock and still have huge connection to BlackRock. Biden also has a history of enacting policy and rules that are very BlackRock friendly, and many argue stem from BlackRock. And BlackRock is well known throughout the world for their connections to many different governments, to many different organizations, to many different governing authorities. And this kind of influence is likely to expand pretty aggressively as we head into the next couple of years. So anyways, I thought this was an interesting story worth covering. Let us know what your thoughts are on this. Is BlackRock getting too powerful, or are they just playing the game? Let us know what you think.